An emergency fund is often touted as a cornerstone of financial security. But in a world where financial advice is abundant and sometimes contradictory, it's important to question the true necessity of setting aside money for unforeseen events. How much is enough? Is the typical recommendation of 3 to 6 months' worth of expenses really necessary for everyone? The purpose of an emergency fund is simple. It provides a safety net in times of crisis, such as job loss, medical emergencies, or major home repairs. However, the size and structure of this fund depend on individual circumstances, lifestyle, and financial goals. For some, having an emergency fund might seem like a non-negotiable element of financial planning, while for others, it could feel like an unrealistic or burdensome target. In this exploration, we will assess the true necessity of an emergency fund, break down its purpose, and evaluate the conditions under which it is a must-have and when it might not be as crucial as we are often led to believe. Is your emergency fund really necessary? Debunking common myths. Sarah, a young professional, had always been told that an emergency fund was the key to financial security. The rule of thumb, 3 to 6 months of expenses in savings, was ingrained in her mind. After all, her financial advisor stressed it as an essential step in building wealth. But when Sarah sat down to calculate how much she actually needed, something didn't feel right. She realized she hadn't faced a major emergency in 5 years, and her job was stable with health insurance. Why was she saving so aggressively? Over time, Sarah began questioning the common advice. Was having such a large sum of money just sitting there really helping her achieve her financial goals? In her case, she discovered that her emergency fund didn't need to be so high. Instead, focusing on building other assets and creating smaller, more flexible savings could work just as well. By rethinking the traditional rule, Sarah was able to shift her saving strategy and work toward financial freedom in a more personalized way. How much should you really save for emergencies? The truth revealed. James had always heard that an emergency fund should cover 3 to 6 months of living expenses. As a freelance graphic designer, he wasn't sure whether this advice applied to him. He didn't have a steady paycheck, and his income fluctuated month by month. So he diligently saved a portion of each paycheck, aiming for that 6-month target. But after a year, James started feeling like he was trapping himself in a cycle of saving without being able to focus on other financial goals, like investing in his business or saving for a home. One day, during a casual conversation with a fellow freelancer, James learned a valuable lesson. His friend had managed to build a thriving business by focusing on a smaller emergency fund and adjusting based on fluctuating income. James realized that for him, 3 months of expenses was more than enough, as he had multiple income streams and an emergency savings cushion from other investments. By recalibrating his goals, James felt empowered to use his savings in a way that better suited his unique financial needs. Emergency fund versus financial freedom. What should you prioritize? Maria, a passionate entrepreneur, had always been focused on the idea of financial freedom. For years, she diligently set aside money in her emergency fund, following the advice of saving 6 months' worth of expenses. However, as time passed, Maria began to wonder, was she focusing too much on her emergency fund at the cost of her long-term financial growth? She had a solid business, and while unexpected expenses did arise, they weren't frequent enough to warrant keeping such a large safety net. After speaking with a mentor who had achieved financial freedom, Maria realized that her emergency fund could be more flexible. Rather than focusing solely on saving for crisis, she could redirect some of that money toward investments that would generate wealth in the long run. Maria decided to reduce her emergency fund to 3 months' worth of expenses, freeing up cash for growth opportunities. In doing so, she felt a greater sense of financial empowerment, understanding that balancing both emergency preparedness and wealth building was key to her financial independence. The surprising truth about how much you actually need in your emergency fund. David had always believed that a large emergency fund was the key to peace of mind. As a young family man with 2 kids and a mortgage, he followed the common advice of saving at least 6 months' worth of expenses. Every month, he scrimped and saved, but he still felt a bit uneasy. What if there was an even more effective strategy? One day, David decided to take a closer look at his finances. After analyzing his spending habits, he realized that most of his major expenses, like his mortgage, utilities, and car payments, were fairly predictable. His job was secure, and he had health insurance. David then began to question, was his emergency fund really providing the security he thought it was? The truth hit him. He didn't need as much as he thought. By reducing his emergency fund to 3 months' worth of expenses, he freed up significant money that he could invest in stocks and real estate. This decision allowed David to feel more financially secure while still having the flexibility to grow his wealth. Building an emergency fund. Are you overdoing it? Emma, a successful lawyer in her 30s, had always prided herself on her financial discipline. She made sure to save a generous emergency fund that covered 6 months' worth of her expenses. But as her career progressed, Emma began to question if this level of saving was truly necessary. Her job was stable, and she had a decent retirement plan and health insurance. What if she could allocate her money more effectively elsewhere? After discussing her finances with a colleague, Emma realized that she might be overdoing it. Her colleague, who also had a stable job, suggested focusing on a smaller emergency fund that could cover 3 months of expenses. With the extra funds, Emma could invest in assets that would provide greater returns. Emma decided to experiment and cut her emergency fund back to 3 months. To her surprise, she felt less stressed about saving and more confident in her ability to grow her wealth. Emma realized that sometimes less is more, and having just enough in her emergency fund allowed her to focus on building her financial future. Why most people get their emergency fund calculation all wrong. John, a single father of 2, had always believed that the key to financial stability was having an emergency fund that covered 6 months' worth of expenses. As a teacher with a modest income, John worked hard to save, cutting back on extras and living frugally. But despite his efforts, he constantly felt behind. He was saving, yes, but he wasn't able to make progress toward other goals like college savings for his kids or retirement. One evening, after a conversation with his financial planner, John discovered something eye-opening. Most people, including himself, get their emergency fund calculation wrong by focusing solely on monthly expenses. He was saving too much for an emergency fund and neglecting to account for the fact that his expenses were largely predictable. With the right insurance and a little cushion for unpredictable events, John realized that he only needed 3 months of expenses in an emergency fund. By adjusting his saving strategy, he freed up funds to invest in his children's education and start building a more secure financial future. Should you really have 6 months of savings? The answer might shock you. Samantha, a marketing manager, had always lived by the rule that saving 6 months of living expenses was the gold standard for financial security. However, after a few years of diligently putting money into her emergency fund, she started to feel that something wasn't adding up. Despite the large cushion she had built, she still found herself stressed about other financial goals, like saving for a home and paying down debt. Curious to understand if 6 months was truly necessary, Samantha dug deeper into her financial situation. After reviewing her income, lifestyle, and potential emergencies, she realized that her stable job, combined with health insurance and a strong network, meant that her risk of a major financial setback was low. In fact, she only needed 3 months' worth of expenses to cover typical emergencies. The revelation was eye-opening. By scaling back her emergency fund to a more manageable size, Samantha redirected the extra savings into other areas, such as investing and debt reduction, which ultimately made her feel more in control of her financial future. In the end, the ideal size of your emergency fund depends on your unique financial situation. While the traditional 6 months of savings may work for some, it's not a one-size-fits-all solution. By evaluating your income stability, lifestyle, and other financial safety nets, you can determine the amount that truly offers peace of mind without overburdening your financial growth. Flexibility and smart planning are key to achieving both security and financial freedom.